Welcome to this outstanding second summit of drug safety in the COVID era. Today we have an event in collaboration with Mother Risk International. Mother Risk International has been created by Professor Cohen in Toronto, and he's well known all over the world to provide services and advices for pregnant women and for exposure in drug for the fatal exposure of drug. So I would like to share my screen with my slide. Just a few slides. So our chairman today is Professor Cohen, and this is following the first summit who was held in 15th of July. That you can see the recording on our website. So the agenda today is we have first Dr. Mike Cohen, who will speak about his experience and ISMP experience during this pandemic. Then we have Professor Nick Sevdalis, who will talk about the assessment of the implementation and the impact for all infographics. And then Marco Tuccori will tell us a few things about the infodemic that is just terrible right now. And then a few words about our chairman, Professor Cohen. He's the director of Mother Risk International, head of pharmacology in Yale University, and he has created Mother Risk International. He's a pediatrician, pharmacologist, and has written about 15 books on drug safety and thousands of articles. So please, Gideon, you are invited to introduce our summit.
Thank you very much for your participation from all over the world. And this is all an achievement of Irene, who is really working tirelessly on bringing the world together on drug safety. Our first speaker, very well known, Michael Cohen, he will talk about medication safety during the COVID era pandemic. What have we learned in the United States? And Michael, for those who haven't known him before, is the president and founder of the Institute of Safe Medication Practices. And for over 35 years, he works closely with the FDA to prevent medication errors. And of course, we are all looking forward to hear the USA experience, both because of the size, but also because of the huge concentration of medical scientists and other scientists. So it's fair to say that it's the place to learn more, and we all learn from the United States. Michael.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Cohen, and thank you, Irene. I'm going to share my slides. I hope you can see them.
Yes.
So I'm going to present in two parts. I figured it's probably a good idea to give a little bit of background information about our program in the United States, the medication safety during COVID. And this has been a very interesting thing for us. We've had a lot of reports, actually. And, you know, I'm sure some of you have obviously worked in critical care yourselves. And you can imagine the, you know, in the United States, we continue to have a big problem. We have about 1,000 deaths a day in the United States. Very concerning, obviously. We have some surges that have been going on in different areas of the country. We're seeing some improvement in the southern United States. Now it's growing in the northern. And we hear from the critical care nurses. We hear from the doctors. We hear from the pharmacists. And you can imagine what it must be like when there is a surge of patients hitting the critical care unit. When this first started in March and April, we were totally unprepared. we were beginning to even develop intensive care units outside of the intensive care unit. We were building tents. We were taking athletic arenas and building intensive care units out of them in order to be able to house the patients. We don't see that so much. They weren't really utilized all that much outside of the hospital, but it's been pretty amazing. Very hectic, a lot of disorganization, staffing shortages, people getting sick sometimes, having to use people that aren't used to working in critical care, so they don't know how to use some of the equipment, or they've never been trained to use barcode systems. We use a lot of barcoding in the United States. We're able to do that. We have a law that FDA requires. It's a regulation. Manufacturers have to put a barcode on the label of all drugs. And so we use the equipment now to scan it to make sure we're giving the right drug. The critical nature of patients, they're all very, very sick, obviously. And then what happens is we have PPE shortages. So, you know, people have trouble traveling from one patient room to another, or going outside the room and back in and having to change PPE. So in this scenario, not knowing how to use some of the pumps that we're using, if you have patients coming in that aren't familiar with them, it becomes a big problem, and it becomes an error-prone situation. We sometimes leave medication for one patient in a room when a patient dies or gets transferred because they have improved. They get transferred out of ICU, and some of the bags of medication remain, and that has been a source of error if they get confused with a new patient that comes into the room. So, for example, one of the things we've run into is wrong concentration, especially with the vasopressors and with fentanyl, or wrong drug with the vasopressors, or fentanyl and another drug. And I'll explain that in a second. So, for example, 2 concentrations of fentanyl in one hospital were reported, a 10 microgram per milliliter and a 50 microgram per milliliter. And obviously, in one of these cases, the wrong concentration of fentanyl was hung. On the good news side, we have patients that are intubated and they're on ventilators. And so it is not the same problem as it would be if the patient wasn't receiving artificial ventilation of some type. But the wrong concentration has been administered due to removing drug from a drawer in the patient's room that was there from a previous patient. And this is a frequent type of error. We also have this type of error with prescribing, where the wrong medication is selected off a screen, or I should say the wrong concentration, or the way that the drug is administered. The dosing might be different. So in some hospitals, they have multiple ways to actually order the drug. Microgram per kilogram per minute, milligram per hour for some drugs, milligram per 24 hours or milligram per day, multiple ways of expressing the concentration and the dose. And if the nurse chooses the wrong one, fortunately we have smart infusion pumps. I don't know, how well they have been implemented in other countries. We know some countries use them. In the United States, we've even integrated them in hundreds of hospitals with the medical record, the electronic health record. So when the doctor prescribes them, they will actually get an alert if the concentration is too high, or the rate of administration exceeds a certain parameter that's been built into the system. So this is all developed over the last 20 years or so, 15 years. And it is a way to prevent errors, but we do have these errors that still get reported because, as I was saying earlier, sometimes the nurses that are taking care of the patients have not been properly trained to use the equipment or avoid using the equipment. Another issue is alarms. Again, you could have a pump alarming in one room and a nurse might have responsibility for more than one patient. And there's generally only one patient in the ICU room, so it may take some time for the patient to leave the room, remove their PPE, and then don again and go into another patient's room. That doesn't always get done either. So a lot of disorganization is taking place when there are surges, and we have those kinds of reports reaching us. So we have some recommendations that I'll get to in a minute. This is the wrong concentration. A lot of it has been due to similar labeling. You know, you can tell people to read the label all you want. Sometimes when the labeling of products is very similar, people suffer confirmation bias. They believe that what they have is what they expect to have. And unfortunately, they pick up the wrong container. So here we had an issue with a patient with hypotension. This was a fatal event. A patient with severe hypertension. And I'm trying to move this because it's blocking some of my, there we go. A patient with severe hypertension, and they had norepinephrine titrated. They wanted to titrate it up, but the patient's blood pressure continued to drop as they titrated it up. They never had any effect on the patient's severe hypotension. And after the patient died, they found that they had actually been titrating fentanyl and upping the fentanyl. So again, you know, we have some recommendations for preventing this type of error that I'll get to in a minute as well. Because bedside barcode scanning technology may not have been used, and the smart pump drug library, the smart pumps have a drug library that you can set for too high a dose, too low a dose, too high a concentration, too low a concentration. And it can be a very effective way if it is in fact engaged. But again, not everybody has engaged that. Also, as I just said a little bit earlier, some of these pumps are even integrated with the electronic health record. So it isn't even the nurse that sets, you know, that actually inputs the order. It's the prescriber, the physician, that will get the message, because the drug library is in the electronic health record, as well as the pump. The nurse can make some changes, but it's basically the physician that gets that. And it has been a real great way to prevent medication errors. So here's what we have recommended for safe practice recommendations. Standardize to a single concentration, or where there's multiple concentrations, perhaps two at most, for high alert medications. These are drugs and drug categories that are most likely to injure patients when used in error. We call them high alert drugs. It's something that we established years ago. Taking into consideration that the patient may need fluid restriction. That's why you will see some of the higher concentrations that might still be necessary. Standardize the way that we administer the medication, if at all possible. We have seen up to 7 and 8 different methods for dosing a patient for the same drug. You can imagine how error-prone that is. So if we can go to just microgram per kilogram per minute with a drug, there's no more than one choice, which is something that can be done in some cases. You can avoid the potential for error. And then for common infusions, we highly recommend not the nurse preparation, not nurse labeling, not even pharmacy labeling. We recommend, in the United States, we've been very fortunate to have pre-mixed products by the manufacturer that are commercially available that do allow a visual distinction from one another. And that also can help to prevent medication errors. In addition, if you are dispensing these from the pharmacy, we recommend bold auxiliary labels to critical care infusions when you are dispensing any non-standard concentration, or especially when dispensing a paralyzing agent, a neuromuscular blocker. Sometimes these are used in patients that may not have been intubated yet by accident. And without them being on a ventilator, we have a serious problem because they're paralyzed. They cannot move one muscle in their body. So they can't yell out, they can't bang on a table, and unfortunately they will stop breathing if they're not being ventilated. We also have recommended tall man letters. That is something we developed a while ago for differentiating drug names. We're not real happy with the way things, FDA does require it on some of the manufacturers' products, not all of them. We're looking into better ways like using color, using bolding, using uppercase, using italics for those unique letter characters. We need some research done. What is the best way to present this? But in the meanwhile, we do use those unique letter characters in a drug name. We use uppercase, and we do prefer bolding even in the electronic health record to help differentiate the name. Then labeling all lines leading to the patient, both at the distal end and the proximal end near the pump, so that you could identify which line is going into the patient if the patient is in the room. Another thing that we have always recommended, especially for certain critical care drugs like insulin, not all critical care drugs, not all high alert drugs, is an independent double check. So for example, if you do a calculation, one person calculates the dose or comes up with the flow rate, another person separately, not working with the first person at all, does the same thing and comes up with the same exact dosing recommendation. That's an important way to prevent medication errors. There's also the independent double check that takes place when pharmacy is dispensing and nursing checks their work. That's another way, if they're dispensing the commercial bags, for example, or even the pharmacy prepared bags with a pharmacy label on it, an auxiliary label. So one of the problems, again, was related to the personal protective equipment that, unfortunately, you know, if it's at the bedside, that meant that two people had to go into the room. And we were having a real problem, and even still do in some locations, with the gowns and the gloves and, you know, the N95 masks and so on and so forth. So this became a real problem, and it eliminated some of the double checks that we would normally use, for example, for insulin or for IV opioid. And we were abandoning them, unfortunately. So what we did do was we did recommend, a lot of hospitals were doing independent double checks for every high alert drug. We thought that was not a good idea, especially in light of COVID. So we recommended fewer independent double checks strategically at vulnerable points. We could still do them in the pharmacy. You could even use video conferencing technology. So you could have a pharmacy technician working in the pharmacy preparing IVs and a pharmacist working at home with a camera, and the pharmacy having a camera. You could independently check the pharmacy technician's work. So that was a help. The technology can reduce the number of people that were absolutely necessary for double checks. And that could even be done in the critical care unit. And so this was one way that was recommended, and some hospitals did that. Positioning, this was a really interesting one, and I want to spend a little bit of time with this because I thought it was crazy when it first started. I'd never heard of this other than in MRI, in magnetic resonance imaging. Of course, you can't bring an infusion pump into the room where the magnet is. If it has metal parts, it's going to be attracted by the magnet, and it could even kill the patient if it hit the patient somehow. And it would certainly destroy the equipment. So they do have pumps outside the room, and they use long extension sets in radiology where they have MRI being done. And somebody got the idea somewhere along the line that you could reduce the need for PPE and do a lot of other things that would be very helpful if the pumps were not at the bedside, but were outside in the hallway. And you used extension tubing to run an infusion from the pump to the patient, to the patient's IV. And that started to really pick up. So we went from pumps in the room to pumps in the hallway. I don't know, I'm pretty sure that probably happened in Israel, but I never got any information back from Israel. So I don't know that that took place for sure, but it is very, very common in the United States. It allowed reduced nursing staff exposure to COVID-19 patients. They could change an IV bag. They could respond to an alarm. They could look at, you know, pump information. So there was a real benefit without having to go into the patient room and obviously conserve PPE. In fact, you could even have a nurse that wasn't wasn't caring for that particular patient. They might be walking by and the pump's alarming, and the nurse knew what to do immediately, so it didn't have to be the patient's nurse, which was a real help. They could, fix a problem, for example. And that's what happened. So it was really helpful. And so we had pumps outside the hallway. This is a picture we took not far from our offices in Pennsylvania in the US, in a hospital, and you can see how the pumps were all outside in the hallway. And it would have extension tubing generally running underneath the door, and you needed probably about 15 feet for some patients. We even had people drilling holes through the drywall and putting seals there, because a lot of these rooms, of course, would have negative pressure to prevent any aerosolization of the virus reaching the hallway. It would be removed from the patient room through an exhaust system and negative pressure. So they would even have a seal. We even had one hospital that told us they didn't use extension tubing. They had the primary pump tubing running right to the patient because they moved the patient's bed right up against the drywall. And they were able to do that. So a lot of unique things happened, and providers really started using their head and came up with ways to prevent a lot of problems. Now, there were different types of tubing. There was large volume tubing, what we call a macro bore, where you could run it pretty much without worrying about what the rate was. But that had a lot of volume, so it would take, depending on the rate, it would take some time for the medication to get from the bag outside in the hallway on the pump to the patient. Or you could have small bore tubing or micro bore tubing. There are different sizes of the inner diameter, and that would have a much smaller volume, so it could get to the patient quicker. But if you started running it above about 300 milliliters per hour, the pump would stop running. You would get an alarm, an occlusion alarm. The other thing that happened was we used splitters. So you generally would only have one length of extension tubing on the floor from the pump. You would cover it with chucks. You would tape it down. It wasn't the most sanitary way to do things, and it was always a tripping hazard if it wasn't taped. But it was necessary. And when you did things in balance, that was decided upon. So basically, we used these splitters so you could run an infusion from each bag into the splitter and then have one length of tubing. And you could run, several, 3 or 4 of these infusions that way, one piggyback, for example. Labeling tubing inside and outside the room was important. Infusing compatible medications, so pharmacy had a role here in helping. Many of the operations had critical care pharmacists, but unfortunately there was a retreat during COVID where they were working not in the critical care unit, but outside, maybe in the pharmacy or maybe even at home. Some of that continues to this day, by the way. Like I said, issues with tripping. There was a lot of clustering of care. So even with medications, trying to get all the meds clustered at one time. So you would be able to reduce the number of times a nurse would have to go into the room for, bedside glucose, for drug administration, for whatever. That was really important. Vital sign checks. Again, with the independent double checks, I kind of talked about that already, so I won't go on. We also saw an issue with pumps in the hallway. Where is the barcode scan happening? The nurse is not going into the room. They would put the patient barcode, they would print it out and put it on the pump pole. So that's what they're scanning rather than the patient. Occasionally these poles would be transferred and they would forget to take the ID band with the barcode off of the pole. So they could be reading the wrong patient's barcode and then pulling up medications that the patient wasn't on. So that was a little bit of an issue. We do have some situations like you see in the picture here where there's a glass wall. And sometimes we did have a nurse inside the room and they would be able to remove the patient's armband or print one and then show the nurse on the outside through the glass wall who could scan that armband. So that was a help. So all of these things were, it was a complete learning that we never had happen before. And then even access to the electronic health record became a problem. We just ran into a shortage of extension sets. The companies weren't able to keep up with it, although they saw it coming. Sometimes hospitals had to go back to pumps in the room with the primary sets only, but they were responding pretty quickly. One good news, you could use any manufacturer's extension sets. You didn't have to stick to just the brand of pump that you were using, like you would with the primary set. Occlusion alarms, like I was telling you before, we did have that problem depending on the inner diameter of the extension set that was being used. I talked about some of the benefits of having the pumps in the hallway. A little bit of problem with flow rate accuracy. That was not a big problem that got reported. I'm sorry that I moved that. You had to know how much volume the sets had so you could prime it and reach the drug, get the drug to reach the patient. You had to know how much flushing was needed, how much flushing fluid. So that became one of the issues in clinical practice. I talked a little bit about barcode scanning and the armband, and then having people that were not familiar, like a lot of nurses from the OR where barcoding wasn't used, would be working in critical care, and they just avoided using the barcode because they didn't know how to use it. And we had some medication errors reported for that reason. I talked about some of this. Oh, another thing. When they put the pumps outside in the hallway, they used to have to run extension plugs because there weren't enough plugs right near where the pump was. So that became a tripping hazard as well. Some of the units themselves were negative pressure. And there was even negative pressure in the hallway. So they had to be really careful about how much could come out of the room. A lot of organizational planning was necessary. A lot of problems with pump shortages that we ran into. We started talking about maybe even running some of these by gravity, maybe getting not smart pumps, but maybe syringe pumps were located somewhere in the hospital, or non-smart pumps without the drug library. Look in every nook and cranny and find what you can to run pumps. We recommended, and pharmacy participated in, getting patients off of IVs as soon as possible, switching to oral. Anybody on hydration, we started using PO, oral, instead of hydration IV. Less sets would be used, less extension sets maybe. Consider change in IV set duration policy. So one uses 96 hours, the INS standard, and our CDC recommends 1 week for changes. So a lot of hospitals went to the 1 week recommendation. We started using IV push instead of pumps for some drugs. We made recommendations from guidelines that we developed and are on the IV website for safe practice for IV push medications. We also recommended telling nurses over what period of time the IV push should be given and putting that on the medication record as well, in the electronic record. Using pre-filled and ready-to-administer syringes and bags, as I said before, that has been a major improvement in the United States over the last 20 years. Rather than having pharmacy have to make and pharmacy risking making errors, it presents a much better label in most cases, or even dual labels, one with pharmacy and one with the manufacturer. So the nurse can match both and use the barcode on the container. And then consider issues when giving injections via Y-site connections when the pumps are outside the room. We wanted to make sure that the drug would reach the patient. I mentioned that we started talking about administering some drugs by gravity. That was unusual. We hadn't counted drops for a long time, but we do have some sets in hospitals that, it's 10 drops per milliliter or 15. So you could come up with a rate by counting drops like we used to do in the old days. That was a recommendation where you couldn't get enough pumps. We use volumetric tubing, like we call them Buratrels or Solusets, where you have a chamber with maybe 50 milliliter or 100 milliliter, and you can see the volume on it and infuse that over time. We also used elastomeric pumps, you know, that squeeze the fluid into the patient based on the properties of that elastomeric pump itself and an orifice through which the flow runs on a device, how rapidly that fluid can get to the patient. And some hospitals use those types of devices now. I have a few more slides. Hypodermoclysis, hardly ever use that in the United States in hospitals, but we actually recommended that. That is a subcutaneous gravity infusion, mostly used in long-term care. And some of the hospitals were using pumps in long-term care, so we thought, why not consider that? Some drugs could be administered that way, so we listed that as well. And we went through different things that nurses could do. We had a lot of problems with drug shortages, and I'll pretty much end with some things on drug shortages. One thing we ran out of, as you probably well know, if you're using nebulization in COVID patients, you're probably increasing, you know, aerosolization in the patient's room. And that becomes a hazard to the nurses. So there was a big push for using metered dose inhalers, which don't have that same property. And unfortunately, we started running out of albuterol in metered dose inhalers. And so what was happening and what we had seen in the past, championed as a cost reduction practice, not a safety practice, was reuse of the metered dose inhalers. And although we would never do this under normal operations, a number of hospitals asked us if we could develop a metered dose inhaler common canister, the metal part, protocol for sharing of pre-used inhalers. And everybody would say that's crazy. And by the way, we interacted with CDC, we interacted with FDA. They wouldn't put themselves out in any case. But it was a balance thing. You either risk patients or you come up with and we used government sanctioned disinfectants for this procedure. We put it on our website, and it was something that the hospitals, if they decided to do it, when a patient was discharged, we had a recycling procedure and a disinfecting procedure, and then making that available. And I'm not going to say that there wasn't a risk, and it's not something we would normally do, but you know, when it's albuterol and you need a way to administer it versus aerosolization, that's what's done. You can even develop something for intubated patients with the endotracheal tube. Our anesthesiologist came up with a way of doing that. I think he may have learned it from some others, where you could attach the metered dose inhaler to the patient's endotracheal tube with a little bit of an extension that was used. I don't know that procedure as well as he, so I can't describe it. Anyway, I'm not going to go. I think I pretty much explained it, so let me just jump down. We have some confusion with remdesivir label and remdesivir labeling errors. Unfortunately, we had a number of medication errors. We'll be writing about those next week in our newsletter. We did write about it once already. One of the problems is we have two ways of giving it, and pediatric patients can't have the pre-paired liquid. They need the lyophilized powder, and you have to reconstitute it with water. Unbelievably, every one of these says 100 milligram per vial, 100 milligram, 100 milligram, but one does not say that. It says 5. And we had a hospital that confused this. And when they needed a 200 milligram dose, they actually used 4 vials. It escapes me exactly why or how. We were able to find that. I speculated in the article that we did. The patients got a 4-fold overdose, or I'm sorry, 2-fold overdose each time, and it was 8 patients that got it. So we reported that to Gilead, which, by the way, now has just this past week, we have an FDA emergency use authorization for basically any hospital to be able to use it for patients where they feel it needs to be administered. Before, it was restricted for seriously ill patients that were receiving oxygen or artificial ventilation through ECMO, or were intubated and on a ventilator. And there was some improvement seen. Now, you know, that people have been moving away from that a little bit. There's a new drug brand name too. Tuccori is the name, by the way. They just came up with that, and that is in the latest information. We'll have that in our newsletter next week. Finally, and I'll stop with the with this. Everybody knows about the problems with hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine, and the shortages that we ran into here in the United States, some for political reasons, which was very disheartening to run into. And we actually ran into some problems that were reported where, because of the very long half-life and the recommendation that the drug be used in conjunction with azithromycin, which also can prolong the, or has a long half-life, and can further contribute to prolonged EKG or QT interval on the EKG, putting patients at risk. We actually had some reports where cardiac arrest occurred. So we put out information to remind people, you got to ask if they were on azithromycin as an antibiotic recently, because that actually happened, and they put the patient on it, even though they weren't putting the patient on azithromycin. They had been on it as an outpatient. And so we had a patient with cardiac arrest. We had other issues as well. You know, you're free to use these things. I did have, I forgot a couple other things, I'm sorry. We did do a lot with having pharmacists verifying orders, trying to set up the times to cluster the doses that were administered for the nurses to save them going into the room, or PPE. You know, extending the length of the administration sets. There's another thing for some of the drug shortages we ran into. In the United States, we used a lot of propofol for sedation for patients in the ICU. We always did that. But we always had a 1%. All of a sudden, Fresenius Kabi, because of the drug shortage, they imported a 2%. So everything had to be cut in half. The infusion rates had to be cut in half. The amount of dose that was being given had to be cut in half, because now you have twice the concentration. So we put out a lot of alerts on that. That's out there now. I haven't had any reports, fortunately. We did get, the company did agree to put stickers on it to remind people this, you see the yellow caution note that this is 2%. Another thing that we had was distribution of neuromuscular blockers, because in the United States, all of our neuromuscular blockers have this wording on the cap of vials, warning paralyzing agent. And it kind of sets it apart from other drugs. But all of a sudden, the manufacturer overseas, because we ran into a drug shortage for several of these neuromuscular blockers, they started producing them for companies here in the United States, but they weren't able to get these caps. So they made them without that warning on the cap. And then when you store it in a cabinet on the nursing unit, or even in the pharmacy, it can look very much like another drug that has the same color cap. Some of them were yellow, some of them were gray, some of them were a brownish color. And then you really risk accidentally giving a paralyzing agent. So we put out national warnings on that as well. So again, a lot of this is communication, getting information from the field, develop a reporting program, or work with a practice group, physicians, nurses, pharmacists. Ideally, all three would develop a group like that. Perhaps it can be done on an international level, because, you know, in many countries they import drugs, so they use drugs from different countries. Maybe we could work together and develop an independent program that would serve the needs of several companies. We're looking into that with IMSN, as I told you. Anyway, I'm going to end it there. I highly recommend that independent practitioner reporting, because that's where all this information came from. And that's how we and our FDA and the manufacturers have been able to do a pretty darn good job, I think, at reducing the risk of medication errors in the United States. Thank you very much, Irene. I'm sorry I went over a little.
Thank you very much, Michael. This was very, very important. Show what an pandemic does to a whole system that thought that it's on the point within all these new variables. Just because of time, we'll move to Professor Nick Sevdalis. The talk is about a very important topic, the impact of patients' engagement on infographics to report adverse events. And Nick is the head of the Center for Implementation Science and Patient Safety at the famous King's College in London. Please, Nick.
Thank you. Mike, if I could ask you to stop sharing so I can bring up my slides. Brilliant, thank you. Now let me... Okay, can you see this? So
Yes.
people are nodding. Brilliant, thank you. Well, thanks very much. What a great pleasure to be with you guys today, and to have met some of you around this time. I think it was July last year when we were physically rather than virtually together at the meeting that Irene and her team led and hosted, which was a real pleasure. So we have to work virtually these days, but also this is an opportunity to exchange ideas, experiences. What a great presentation, Mike. I really enjoyed this. A lot of human factors and design related issues in what you've described, some of which I've worked with and seen my own sort of research in the past. But you guys are now on for something a bit different, because when we spoke with Irene about the contents of this session and what might be useful to cover, what we discussed was to talk a bit about the elements of behavior change, how you evaluate implementation of various tools. And Irene, I know, and a few others were very keen on how we look at the patient side of things and how can we actually evaluate what is the real impact of the reporting the patients might be engaged with. And very kindly, Irene, you shared some examples of recent attempts that have been made. So I use those as examples to share with you briefly some very practical methods that I have used, other people have developed. These are not things I've developed myself. I'm using them in our own practice and research. In fact, we're using a lot of the methods that you will see in the next sort of 20 minutes or so. I'll show you in the next 20 minutes or so in evaluating the COVID response in the hospital that I'm responsible for, which is a mental health, one of the largest mental health hospitals in the world, the Maudsley Hospital in South London. But I'm not presenting anything to do with mental health. I will present examples around medication sort of adverse events and the specific interventions that we've discussed. You'll see on the next slide. So here's an outline of the next sort of 20 minutes. The key issue is how could you measure very pragmatically and very practically the success and the impact when you implement a sort of patient-driven interface or a patient-driven intervention to learn more about anything to do with the usage or adverse events or safety issues with drug utilization. So there's three things that I want to cover. If you think about three different sort of components of the talk, one is what's called the theory of change methodology and the visual aspect of this, the visual mapping that it allows, which is called the logic model. So I'll show you examples of that. I will then share some very brief and therefore I think quite practical validated measures that you can use to evaluate the success of your implementation. So how acceptable, how feasible, and how appropriate your patients and indeed the providers are finding these interventions, and do so quite simply and briefly. And lastly, I will show you an online available resource for you, which is based on theory around why implementation works and why it might fail. I will talk you through how you could set up interview studies, so collect qualitative data to evaluate the same questions. And then hopefully we'll have some time, if time in the program allows, to reflect a bit and think about how these things might be used in your setting. So these are a couple of the examples that Irene, if you remember, you shared with me in July, and we talked about them. So these are the sort of things, these are sort of flyers that encourage patients to undertake certain behaviors. The one on the right, if you look at the pointer here, is basically directing the patients to the use of this app, My E-Report, and it has a flow chart that explains to the patient what they need to be able to do once they've experienced an adverse event. And very nicely at the bottom, it also provides a rationale for why this is important. The one on the left, you will see that's from sort of ISO Central, as it were, and it gives us sort of, again, there's 4 blocks on this, highlighting to the patients what they need to sort of pay attention to. So that's the sort of thing that I'm interested in for the purposes of today. The methodologies can be used for all sorts of interventions, but let's think about those things. How do we know whether using any of these things or producing any of those information leaflets or flyers actually works? Does it make any difference? So when people ask this question, I think that the thing that I would personally encourage everybody to think a bit more about is, what do we actually mean? What do you really want to know? So the first thing one might want to know, and these are the 3 bullet points here in blue, are the sort of, is a short list of things that you might want to know. Are patients actually following the advice? So once you've given it out to them, or once they've seen it written somewhere, are they doing anything about it? If not, though, why not? Because you want to know what the barriers might be in order to address those barriers. If they are following the advice, well, that's great. But again, you've got to find the reasons that are driving these behaviors, because you need to be able to reinforce those things so they don't sort of fade, they don't fall away from you. But another question that you might want to ask is, we've just seen a great presentation about what happens within an acute hospital. And we know from the evidence base that patients rely a lot on advice and encouragement from health providers when they engage with their own healthcare and their own safety. So do the health providers within your hospital, within your region, indeed within your service, encourage the patients to follow this advice, or they just put a flyer out there on the desk and they don't really interact with the patients anymore? And again, if they do encourage the patients, why do they do that? How can we reinforce that? If they don't, can we make it easier for them to do so? Can we understand what the blocks might be? But lastly, if the patients follow all this advice, does it make any difference? And then it's a question I'm proposing to you to think a bit about. What is the actual difference that you want this to make? Do you want lots and lots of events being reported, or incidents or adverse events reported by the patients? But to what effect? What do you want to do with those? I mean, ultimately, we're talking about improving the safety of medication administration when it comes to the patients and utilization, if the patients are taking this at home. What is the ultimate objective? We need to make this quite clear. And the evaluation that you can think about, to answer the question, I would propose to you, it really depends on which one of these questions you might wish to answer. So the first, if I manage to move my slide, there we go. So the first method that I want to briefly present to you is the so-called theory of change methodology. This has been developed not only within health, in fact, its origins are within international development. So the people who spend millions, or rather billions of pounds, dollars, shekels, euros, whatever it is, in international developments, where you cannot really have randomized controlled trials, they really wanted impact evaluations and wanted to find out whether all these billions are actually making a change and making a difference. And healthcare then adopted this methodology. The methodology is pretty simple in some ways. It looks visually, one of the ways to sort of represent it, it's a method that allows you to build a visual map on one page, this is absolutely critical. It cannot be longer than that. The theory of change, a methodology that allows you to build a map like this one, that basically start from the right-hand side. You start reading from here. The first thing that you need to figure out is the outcome. What are you actually interested in? What are you trying to achieve? Safety, increased reporting, increased recognition of adverse events, better engagement of the patient with their own healthcare, you name it. And ideally, you should be able to plan the timeline of that impact. 12 months, could be 2 years, 6 months, 12 weeks, this is entirely up to you, the timeline that you put here. And once you know these outcomes, once you've established those outcomes, and I'll show you in the next slide how you do that, then you start going backwards. You go from the right to the left, and you try and figure out what are the inputs, the activities, the things to do, and the outputs of those activities that will then facilitate those outcomes, that will ensure that these outcomes basically happen. So if you want patients to, if your outcome is to have better patient engagement with the safety of the drugs that they're taking, the safety of their own care, what are the inputs into this? The knowledge, for example, that has to be present, the interest, the motivation that patients need to have to do that. What are the activities that will then need to happen? Patient education, production of leaflets, like the ones we've seen, production of apps through which the patients can report on adverse events and so on. And if these are in place, what are the outputs? The output might be improved literacy around safety. The output might be improved engagement around safety, which in turn will give you the outcome that you want. So this is effectively a logical sequence of things that need to happen in an order so that you eventually get to the outcomes that you wish to achieve. Now, how do you get to this map? How do you produce this logical map, the logic model? What you do is before I say that, why you do that first, the reason you're doing this. The benefits of, and I'm just summarizing a lot of information in a single slide, the usefulness of a theory of change methodology is basically that it allows you to clarify what you really want to know. What do you want to evaluate? And interestingly enough, when you start using the methodology, you'll see that when you think that everybody in the room has the same idea, you very rapidly find out that people may or may not have the same idea. The methodology allows you to basically explore and agree on what it is that you're trying to evaluate. You're able to identify actions and the processes that you theorize, that you hypothesize, you expect they will lead to those goals. So you have an explicit, the reason it's called the theory of change is because you theorize how the change will happen, you see. So you don't have to bring in any big theory from psychology or sociology or elsewhere. It's your own theory based on your own expertise and evidence as to how these goals will be achieved. It also allows you to clarify your assumptions about how the interventions will work. So you might assume that training is required. You put the training in there, you deliver the training, you find out the training is totally useless. It wasn't training that was needed, it was motivation, because people had all the training they needed, they just were not very keen, they were not very interested in engaging with these behaviors. So once you put all of these things down and you start being able to test them, you're able to test your assumption. It allows you to consider the barriers and the drivers to the implementation process, to that logical sequence that I showed you. And it offers you a blueprint as to what to evaluate. If you look at the previous slide, there's a very clear distinction here between the outcomes to be evaluated on the right-hand side and the process to be evaluated, which is basically the process of implementation. How are you going to put these apps in place? How are you going to incentivize the patients and the providers to use them? And finally, it's a very useful producing engaging people in producing these logic models is an engagement tool. It allows you to communicate your project. It allows you to bring people into your project and make them as sort of a part of the team. And that includes patients and their carers and members of their families who are very important stakeholders in interventions like the ones we're discussing here. So practically, what does it mean to use a theory of change? Basically, it means that you run a series of workshops and you trust that either yourselves or one of your colleagues has good workshop facilitation skills. You bring 2 or 3, usually you need 2 or 3 workshops. Sometimes you need more, sometimes you might be okay with it, just 2 might be enough. You ensure that you get the right people in the room. So you get anything between 6 and 10 or 12 people maximum around the table with a couple of facilitators. And as I said to you, you start from establishing what are the outcomes, and you get everybody to agree on those outcomes. And then you work backwards. You identify inputs, processes, or activities and outputs that will theoretically, you expect them to lead to those outcomes. And you get everybody again to agree on those. And therefore it's really important to get a really good breadth of people with a great, with different expertise. And that's why patients, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, infection disease specialists, you name it, you might need a different configuration of these types of expertise in these workshops. And you importantly brainstorm barriers and drivers, which, for example, we have done when we looked at medication safety at home. And some of the patients were telling us things that we were totally unfamiliar with, wouldn't have thought about. The patient, for example, was not aware what to do if they missed one of the doses of their medication. What do you then do? Do you take double the dose 6 hours later, or do you skip it altogether? Do you call your doctor? These are the sort of things that we hadn't thought about, but obviously they came from the patient. So we talked a bit about who to invite. How do you figure out who should attend these workshops? And this is, I mean, if you Google this, it comes up. So this is a sort of management tool. This sort of it's called the stakeholder mapping tool. How do you decide who you invite to design those logic models? And there's two things you care about: how interested people are, and let's assume they have no interest at all, so they've got very low interest, or they've got a very high interest. For example, you know, if you're a diabetic patient, you might have an extremely high interest in how your diabetic medication might interact with anything else you're taking. But if you're not, then you know your interest is probably going to be very low. And then there's the power issue. Who's got the power to make decisions, to allocate the budgets, or to help people change their behavior? So you think about these with your colleagues. So you brainstorm who the right people are, and then you end up with this sort of grid. So basically, the people who have very high interest and very high power, they're up here. You really want to keep them involved. You have to manage them very closely. You need to bring them into the process. If you ignore them, they will stop your intervention. They will not approve the budget. They might be quite detrimental to you achieving your objective. Equally, if someone has very low interest and very low power, you know, you don't have to worry too much about them. These are the people who are not going to cause any problems to you, because this is not really their thing. They're not really interested in what you're doing. The people who've got high power but low interest, this might be a very senior chief executive. They've got very high power. They can stop a project in its tracks, but because they deal with so many things, their level of interest might be relatively low. But you have to keep them satisfied, because again, they can pull the plug on your project and they might reallocate your team, or you might get zero finances, and therefore you cannot do your project, cannot do your evaluation. But equally, there might be people who have very high interest but very low power. Sometimes you find that these are some of the patient advocacy organizations. They're external organizations. Unless you invite them in, they haven't got the power to sort of muscle through. But it's really important that you keep them informed, because in fact, they might be really useful allies for you to bring into your evaluation. What does all this mean in practice? So I've tried to do one of those myself. So here is an example of one of your interventions. This is the My eReports app, which the patients can use to report medication adverse events. So what I started to do, I basically put a logic model up myself. I started from the outcomes, and you can see how you can work out the outcomes. So you could say that for a particular drug, the safety incidence for a particular group of patients, say again diabetes patients, will need to be reduced by 75%. And we need to have that within, let me pull that down, we need to have that within 12 months. By the end of 12 months, we need to have this outcome. Or you could say, we really want to develop a new and successful model for how you engage patients in safety incident reporting, because we don't have one. The patients are totally passive. Can we develop something? And then I work backwards from this and say, okay, if this is your objective in 1 year, perhaps, you know, if you had a workshop or two, people would have said, what do you want to do at 6 months from the beginning of the project? All the patients need to be aware of the app, because if they're not aware, they're not going to be able to use it, are they? You want the number of reports submitted by patients through the app to be doubled what perhaps the initial rate is. If the initial rate is 0, you have to come up with a figure. You want, for example, to say that all the reports that are submitted, they get a response, because you know very well that someone who doesn't get a response will not submit any further reports. And finally, ISOP Israel might decide to put together a committee to offer feedback to those institutions, to those experts, and to show sort of national support for the project. So that's the sort of 6-monthly outcome. Closer to now, at 3 months, say between now and Christmas, you want all the providers of your clinic to be aware of the app, because if they're not, how they're going to promote it to the patients. You want about half of the patients to be able to know about the app, and you need to start somewhere with instant reporting. So you see, I've worked out a number of different outcomes I'm sort of interested in. And as I'm doing this, I've also listed some of the barriers and facilitators. This is the bottom row here. So for example, if ISOP in Israel makes a commitment to provide ongoing feedback, this will be a major driver, because it will show that the national organization actually cares about all this and reinforces the use of the app. But equally, you might find there's a barrier because people are initially enthusiastic, but then they haven't got really time to keep doing this, so they drop off, their enthusiasm disappears, or it's not really sustainable. You get a bit of funding to start this off, and then the funding disappears, the budget, it gets depleted, and no one else invests any more money, and therefore you're back to square one within about 6 months. So these are the sort of things that one would consider. And what I've done in the first 3 columns here, inputs, activities, and outputs, I've sort of listed various things that, you know, are inputs into this process. So the commitment of ISOP to improving the safety of a particular drug, the potential that there is currently, there's a need, and there's also motivation to enhance the safety within diabetes clinics for that particular drug. Patients already have reported that they get drug-related adverse reactions when they take these drugs at home on their own under no supervision. There is evidence globally that if someone is actually, why would you use an app? So the input here is that there is good evidence that patients can use apps, and if they use apps, they feel more engaged and they can improve the safety of their care. And there's in fact behavior change evidence that health apps are a great sort of methodology to use. So the barrier there would be, for example, that this is one app, but at the same time, with your hospital, there's another 20 apps that are being launched, and therefore there is a competition for attention. But equally, there's a driver to all this, because you, for example, have found that there's generally a good IT literacy within this patient group, because they're really used to using devices and using apps. If the literacy is not there, that would be a barrier. So this is the way you think this through. I produced this as an example for you, but this would be the outcome of a consensual series of workshops. And you see the strength of this. Once you've got this, you know exactly what you need to do, you know exactly what you need to measure, and you can start piling up evidence as to whether your intervention is actually doing its job and how well it's doing that. Now, all of this is predicated on human factor. It's not just about evidence, either public health evidence or medication safety evidence or behavior change evidence. It's how we get the evidence into practice. So the thing that I would suggest to you here is to think about the clinical evidence. The clinical effectiveness evidence is really important, because in your case, you're really interested in drug effectiveness, drug safety, and so on. But what we're really talking about here is we need to also be thinking about implementation effectiveness. So what is the strategy you're going to use to implement all of this? Does it work to introduce behavior change? So is an app a useful way of doing that? Is a flyer a useful way of educating people around the app, and so on? And the unit of analysis is not just the patient, because remember, there's so many barriers within the healthcare system around the patient. The providers and sometimes the healthcare managers are really important to focus on. So the evidence base in terms of what you measure, I would suggest to you, includes this sort of list. This is a sort of gold standard list of the sort of things that you should be looking at when you implement these interventions. How acceptable they are they actually adopted, are people using them? Because there's no point developing an app if no one's downloading it. Are they seen as appropriate? Are they feasible? And so on and so forth. So I'm just leaving that for you there, and I'm going to give you a way of measuring some of those outcomes. These are 3 validated instruments, and these are the actual questions that will tell you the perceived acceptability, the perceived appropriateness, and the perceived feasibility of any intervention, in this case, of the apps that we're talking about. So the wording is standardized, and where you've got the brackets, you basically slot in the intervention of interest, which I've done for you. So this is what if you take the e-report app, this is how you would evaluate it. So this is the exact wording. You just give this app with 1 to 5 scales, and then you sum them up, or you average them, and you've got a sense as to whether your patients and your providers are actually finding what you're doing with this app acceptable, appropriate, and feasible. If they don't, the implementation will fail. So this is a quick way of measuring it. So you're getting towards the end. Another way of looking at your implementation is to look at the barriers and the drivers. So yes, people might want to use something, but why are they doing it, or why are they not doing it? So there is a lot of research that supports that these 5 factors, and this is a theory here that I've put on this slide. There's these 5 factors that drive the success or the failure of an implementation. So the characteristics of what you're trying to implement, in this case, the e-report app, the evidence base that supports it, and so on. The setting, which may be your hospital, the service, or a clinic, could be the entire country, depends on what you're trying to evaluate. That's the inner context, the inner setting. The outer setting is the wider context, national or regional. What are other people or other hospitals or other clinics are doing? The individuals involved, the providers, the patients, the families, and the process of implementation. So how do you study that? Very helpfully, there's a website that's dedicated to this, and it basically gives you ready-made questions that you can use in an interview. So you put these in an interview, and there's loads and loads of questions. I've just picked some of them. For example, if you're interested in whether an organization is supporting its members to promote these apps, do they find this complicated? Do the influential people within the organization champion it? Or do they just say, no, this is all useless, we shouldn't be doing it? Because if they say that, then you're not really going to go very far. So effectively, if you go on this website, it gives you a list of questions, and you can pick and choose what you want to ask, so you get a good picture, a full picture of why, how these 5 factors might be facilitating or stopping your intervention. And finally, what do you do to get all of these things to actually work? Again, there's quite good evidence here that there's a number of things that we can use in healthcare to improve implementation. So people have reviewed the literature, and they've grouped, they've themed those implementation strategies. And these are the 9 themes that come out in the literature. And you will see, interestingly enough, that the leaflets and the flyers that you produced within ISOP are one of those strategies. The different things you can do. So training and education, which I've highlighted here, this is what leaflets are achieving. But there's all sorts of other things. So audit and feedback, getting feedback at a hospital level or at national level, which we've heard already about after an incident has been analyzed and safety advice has been disseminated. Providing facilitation and supervision, allowing people to adapt and tailor, engaging stakeholders. This is why I'm going on and on about using theory of change, because that allows you to bring stakeholders in. Supporting providers when they interact with patients, engaging with patients. It could be a national patient organization, for example, that you bring in, and we find these organizations are very powerful in many ways to advocate. Sorry, they're very interested in advocating about patients and so on. So there's different things that you can do, and again, all these have been summarized, and there's a very nice sort of within this paper, there's a very nice table that summarizes what you can do. So once you've done your theory of change, or once you've done your interviews, you know what the problems are, you go and cherry pick those strategies. So this is the end of the presentation. Effectively, I wanted to bring some sort of practical things to you, to your attention, that might help you in evaluating interventions such as these apps, but also other things. So I'm stopping here, and I don't know whether there's, we have time for questions or not. Up to the chair.
Yes, sure. Any questions to Nick?
Yes, a lot of questions. First of all, thank you so much. You have given to me a lot of tools and methods to go further on this project, and I really hope that all the people who are here in this conference will be ready to help me to implement this app and this infographic. And what was you were speaking about barrier and driver? We had a full project, a full strategy of different methodology, different methods and tools in Mayana Yeshua Hospital in Israel, and so we have worked during more than 1 year, almost 2 years in this hospital, going from step to step. And then when we arrived to this step, we had suddenly like a fear from the people who were already involved in all the project to take a responsibility. What do we do if we know that people have adverse reaction? And these were not people who are dealing usually with drug safety. Nurses, people who are risk management, but who are not dealing with the idea of analyzing adverse reaction. So suddenly we were stuck, and then the COVID arrived. So we have now to go back and to organize this workshop to convince them. And you have given to me a lot of ideas. Thank you so much.
No, Irene, thank you. Just a brief comment. I mean, it's really important. I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, we just did a review a few years ago about all incident reporting systems like on the planet, you know, what stops people, not patients, providers and pharmacists and doctors from reporting. The major stoppage is, what do you do with the report? If you just put reports into a big black hole, they disappear. There's no feedback. There's no visible to the reporter, a visible action. So you put in a report and something happens. If that is not there, then people will say, well, actually, there's no point in reporting. So I would say to you, Irene, not to you personally, to your colleagues around the apps, it's great if the patients are reporting, but what are you going to do with the report? And how is this going to get cascaded to, say, frontline providers? Because if these are the people who prescribe, and then the patient reports from home, they need to find out what happened. So you need to have a learning loop that goes back to that doctor or that nurse prescriber, if you have them, and so on, that they know that something went wrong and this is what the issue was. So this learning loop is what makes reporting useful. And I think if you did a workshop sort of approach, that hopefully would be one of the factors that come up to establish a driver for people to report.
Thank you, Nick. Yeah. I will let Irene present Marco, whom she knows for many years.
Okay, thank you so much, Nick. Really, it was enlightening. And now we have Dr. Marco Tuccori with us. He has written very lately in Drug Safety an article about Infodemic. And Marco is a pharmacist and pharmacologist. He's a coordinator of the Tuscany Pharmacovigilance Center, working with IFA, the Italian agency on signal detection, and teaching in the Pisa faculty of pharmacy. So, and he's a board of ISOP, and we know each other for a long time. For the beginning, we were in ISOP. So thank you, Marco, to be with us.
Thank you, Irene, for your presentation, for your introduction. I remember when we met the first time was in 2013 in Pisa during the annual meeting of ISOP I have organized at that time, and from there on we have several times the opportunity of collaborating, but this is the very first time we achieved this goal of collaborating together. So I will discuss in the next more or less 30 minutes. I would like to try to remain in the time of the webinar. the problem of infodemic and what was the impact of the infodemic on pharmacovigilance activities. This is exactly the title of an article I have recently published on drug safety, which born from a request of the editor of Drug Safety after I have reviewed an editorial on a similar topic. What was the infodemic? The infodemic was defined as a sort of massive dissemination of information related to the disease, in this case, the COVID-19 disease, of course, spread through all the media. There are a lot of media, there are a lot of kind of news, of information that can be spread. And I think that one of the duty of pharmacovigilance is that of monitoring this kind of communication. Maybe sometimes in pharmacovigilance center, the communication is somehow neglected as an activity in comparison to other activities of daily life work in the center. I think that we should implement this particular kind of activity in pharmacovigilance center. News are maybe verified, news are fake news that are spread for some interest that can be political or just to support an idea or whatever the motive that led people to spread such news. But what we surely know is that this news has an effect on population behavior. In the case of COVID-19, of course, there were a lot of information related to the disease itself. So, for instance, what are the main symptoms? There was a large debate about, for instance, the anosmia and ageusia, the disturbances of olfactory or tasting that are early symptoms of the disease, about the vaccine and the need for vaccination. You know that no vaccine legacies fight against the use of any kind of vaccine, even in this case when we are in a situation in which a vaccine would be so much desirable. And of course, even drugs are involved in these infodemics. Which kind of drugs? The infodemic COVID-19 concerned drugs are proven for other indication that could have potential efficacy in the prevention or treatment of COVID-19. Not only, but also involved commonly used drugs that could instead favor infection or an unfavorable prognosis of the disease itself. Produce distorted information on drugs often supported by weak scientific evidence. Beside here, you have this tweet from this Daniel Smith. I don't know, I have no idea what she is, but I tried to provide to you some example of how communication worked during particularly the first months of the outbreak of COVID-19. And my experience will be very related to what happened in Italy. You know that we were the country, the Western country that first faced the outbreak of COVID-19, and we had no idea what to do. We have no idea what to expect, especially for other healthcare systems. So people were particularly sensible to what was the communication at that time. But here we have some examples that come from United States. I would like just to remark that I will not be too much political in this presentation, because science is science, political is political. But as a scientist man, I will always fight against pseudoscience, whatever the source of this message. And even in this case, we have, unfortunately, a lot of examples from government in which the pseudoscience was taken ahead as a flag just for maybe political interests. So we need to check carefully this kind of information, and we must do our job, which is that of providing accuracy in information. So, for instance, look at what was the message of this Daniel Smith. Breaking: new controlled clinical study conducted by doctors in France shows that hydroxychloroquine cures 100% of coronavirus patients within 6 days of treatment. Nowadays, we know that this was a little bit exaggerated, you know, but at that time, many people started trusting this. But there are a lot of pitfalls in this message. The first one is that it does not specify whether you can take the hydroxychloroquine in prevention or, for instance, to treat the COVID-19, so that many healthy people started taking hydroxychloroquine for no reason, because they have not the disease, just to thinking that it can prevent somehow the infection. This was an example of the third point. The fourth point is that COVID-19 infodemic likely influences first opinion leaders, and we are here the example of President Trump, and people particularly active on social media, like President Trump, and could have led to hazardous choices about the use of drugs. Here you see one of the historical messages tweeted by Trump, where he said that hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin taken together have a real chance to be one of the biggest game changers in the history of medicine. Well, a very strong message. The FDA has moved mountains, thank you. Hopefully they will both age, because Trump and hydroxychloroquine are friends, so he friendly called the hydroxychloroquine H, works better with A, another friends of Trump's, and he cited the International Journal of Antimicrobial Agents, a reference to support his communication. Of course, everything is exaggerated, but this kind of message was very effective in the population. So all this situation put ahead new challenge for health authorities and also for pharmacovigilance stakeholders, because it may produce some hazardous behavior in the population in terms of the attitude in taking drugs, you know. So what I did with my staff was that of selecting several drugs, which days could be analyzed to identify what was the triggering event that led to the communication, whether there was a rationale, a scientific rationale for such a communication, what was the media, or what were the media involved in the spread of the information, what were the potential effects of the specific infodemic, and finally, what was the response, the answer given by the regulatory authority. Here you have just a table that summarizes what I'm going to discuss in this presentation. The example were chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, ACE inhibitors and sartans, NSAIDs, and a couple of antiretroviral, favipiravir and umifenvir. There were also surely other examples that we could make. These are examples that have a particular relevance in Italy, but I know, for instance, that in South America, ivermectin was also involved in a similar pattern of information that may have led to hazardous behavior in the population. First of all, chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, I have already introduced the problem. What was the rationale for using that? It was because in 2003, during the epidemic of SARS in Southeast Asia, this drug was used with a certain success. I think that there were no great evidence for that, but anyway, that was the communication at the beginning of the outbreak of COVID-19, especially if taken together with lopinavir and ritonavir. However, and this was the rationale because of the similarity between the two viruses, the SARS and the SARS-CoV-2. Notably, this attraction for investigation, the treatment of COVID-19, given the genetic similarity between the two viruses, started a lot of investigation, clinical investigation all over the world. And one of the studies was that presented in the previous slide, made in French, with a lot of shortcomings, a small open study, not blind, and with a lot of problems of interpretation that cannot provide a message like that hydroxychloroquine is 100% effective in fighting against COVID-19. So what was the effect of this message? This illusion of preventing effect of these drugs, remember that I already discussed about prevention and treatment, given by the media, claims and some governments had detrimental impact in general or in the population behavior. First, countries start stockpile these drugs. There was an uncontrolled purchasing without prescription in internet, online. There were cases of poisoning, And there were some safety reports about adverse drug reactions, such as arrhythmia and QT prolongation, especially when the drug was used in combination with azithromycin. I remember very well that there were countries, the first country stopping the use of even the experimentation of these drugs in hospital was Sweden. But other regulatory authorities started debating about the use of these drugs and started monitoring programs, including my country and including other countries. There was also another important study, the one published on the New England Journal of Medicine by Mira and co-workers, who said that there were no benefits at all with the use of hydroxychloroquine, but with safety concerns. So what was interesting of this article is that it was very criticized by all the scientific community, to such an extent, given maybe the fast publication of this article without not many control on what was the goodness or the methodology of this study, and this study was retracted. And so the information about this drug was then supported again. Although nowadays we know that maybe this article was not very far from what was the real effect of hydroxychloroquine, or the use of hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine in this kind of patients. And one of the best examples of the impact of such kind of communication is this case of poisoning, which was very famous all over the world, about a poisoning that led to dead patients. We take that a man in the United States drank a fish tank cleaner containing hydroxychloroquine, thinking it could have prevented somehow the infection. And we know that, of course, particularly in prevention, hydroxychloroquine had no effects. So this is one of the problems that we could manage. You know, I was developing this article and this investigation, thinking of what was the wave of new adverse reaction we could have seen in spontaneous reporting in our daily life activity. And this was one kind of them. Then another group was that of ACE inhibitors and sartans, and also ibuprofen. I have joined together these drugs, although different categories of drugs, because there can be a similarity in mechanism of actions in which they contribute to the effect in which they have been reported as potentially affecting the COVID-19 disease. In particular, there was this article published on the Lancet Respiratory Medicine by Fang and co-workers suggesting that for the first time that the COVID-19, and particularly the virus of the disease, can use this protein, ACE2, as a gate for entering in the organism. And therefore, drugs that can increase the expression of this protein may facilitate the infection somehow. But this situation was even a little more complicated. These drugs are ACE inhibitors, sartans, and even some NSAIDs, sorry, and also some anti-diabetic medication, for instance, glitazones. But the problem was that this drug had been also proposed to be effective in controlling the severity of the disease, because the overexpression of this protein can somehow control the pro-inflammatory cascade, which is related to the ACE inhibitors pathway. And therefore, there was a huge debate between those supporting the use of these drugs in COVID-19 patients just to mitigate the severity of the cytokine storm that led to the pneumonia, the fatal pneumonia related to COVID-19, and the other that say that using this drug would have led to an increase in the possibility of being infected if in contact with the virus. So there was, of course, a scientific debate that that was moved to the public debate, and that triggered the infodemic about these drugs. I would like just to show you this title from Daily Mail. which was wrong somehow, because the title, this title said, high blood pressure and diabetes medication taken by 13 million Americans could raise the risk of serious coronavirus symptoms. Scientists say. It is nice to see always scientists say at the end of the sentence, just to enforce the scientificity of this sentence. But this sentence was completely wrong, because as I have explained it before, it is not a matter of serious symptoms, but it's just a matter of increasing the possibility of being infected, which is completely different with these drugs. But what I would like just to remark is that the font of this title, which is scary, which used the fear as a tool for the communication, is that in comparison to what would have been the best message to give, is this one. However, patients should not stop taking their medication unless their doctor say so. So this is how communication worked during the pandemic, because of what are the rules of journalism, but with possible detrimental effects on the use of the drugs. Of course, what was the problem? People stopped taking, maybe have stopped taking this medication. These are medication for hypertension, and so they could have had important problem with their disease. Then ibuprofen and NSAIDs. In this case, the communication started from the French health minister, who said that they have received, but never published, several serious adverse reports in which the suspected drug was ibuprofen in patients with COVID-19. So they recommended, for instance, the use of paracetamol just in case you need to use such kind of medication, because it was reported as not with the same problem of ibuprofen or other NSAIDs. Here you can see some titles from several websites reporting the communication. There was even in this case a debate and a response from regulatory authorities saying that this problem should be investigated and so on. But the consequences could be that which people needed NSAIDs, for instance, those with rheumatologic diseases, stopped taking these drugs, with potential therapeutic failure even in this case. And also, these messages encouraged the use of acetaminophen, which, you know, it is one of the most frequently reported drug for liver toxicities. So there was also the possibility of being poisoned with this drug, enhanced by such kind of communication. Here you have a summary of what I have just said. So there was an important movement of communication from all the regulatory authorities just to maintain the calm in the population, because of the danger of uncontrolled discontinuation of this medication that in some cases could have relevant consequences for the health of these patients. And so this was the situation for this drug. Then, and the last example I would like to make here is that of the two antiviral, favipiravir and umifenovir, which started both in the same way. They are the first is approved in Japan and not in Italy. I will make the example of Italy in discussing these two slides. And the second is approved in Russia, but not in Italy. And in both cases, the problem arises from two unknown YouTube users. Here you have the guy, he is an Italian guy. Later he was presented like as a pharmacist, but I am not sure about that, who showed the streets of Tokyo with people without mask, with people healthy and with no apparently caution in contact, in maintaining social distances. And he said that this was thanks to this drug, to the favipiravir. And he said that in Italy we could not have this drug because of undisclosed and mysterious conspiracy of our government. And similarly, for umifenovir, another user of YouTube, this guy, at the airport of Moscow, provided a similar situation with people not infected by the virus. We later know that in Russia there were more contagions than in Italy. But anyway, at that time, it seemed that in Russia there were no problem with the coronavirus infection. He went to a pharmacy at the airport of Moscow and bought this Arbidol to treat this disease, because he said that Russians have the miracle drug for controlling the pandemic, and that in Italy there was a conspiracy again, same as seen before. So this was shared several times on YouTube in a few minutes, and newspapers gave another amplification to these two situations. Of course, a regulatory agency, both even for instance Italian and Russian, started a campaign to provide a correct information about these two drugs, but people started purchasing these drugs on the web with potential problems of therapeutic failure or even intoxications. So the spreading of COVID-19 infodemic affects attitudes toward the correct use of drugs, these drugs in particular, and generated different scenarios during the early phases of pandemic, leading to inadequate choices made by individuals everywhere. So what to do? First of all, I tried to characterize this situation. They were particularly just to standardize somehow what happened, maybe to be ready to face another epidemic in the future or even a second wave of problems. There were two situations. The first situation was when the drug has a detrimental effect toward the disease. The population behavior in response to this is the discontinuation of the drug supposed to favor the infection, and then you have compliance problem with the reduction of inapproved indication, so a therapeutic failure. And we expect an increment somehow in the number of therapeutic failure reported by physicians, by pharmacists, by healthcare professionals, or even by citizens, why not, by patients. The second situation was that the drug has a beneficial effect toward the disease, so we have, in the first case, rush to drug purchase with deprivation of drug for the approved indication. We know, for instance, that there was a shortage of hydroxychloroquine for patients with rheumatoid arthritis or similar problem. The rush to drug purchase also caused the increase of online drug purchase and possibly of fake drugs. It is documented in the literature, the availability online of fake hydroxychloroquine, for instance, boxes. And even in this case, of course, you will have a therapeutic failure because you are purchasing nothing, maybe fresh water. Then we have another influence, another effects on population, which is drug intake without medical supervision. So they can take the wrong product. We have the example of the fish tank cleaner. We have seen that. The wrong indication, because people think that taking the drug in prevention or to treat a disease is the same things. And finally, the use of drugs with inappropriate doses, because of the principle that the higher the amount, the best would be the benefit you have. And this is a paradigm that unfortunately always occur when a drug promises miracle effects, particularly in similar situations where the fear is in the population is so widespread. So, what are the challenges in this situation for pharmacovigilance? First of all, we have to implement clinical and observational studies on drug candidates to treat COVID-19, because we need evidence to support or to somehow counter, to fight against this fake news or this poorly supported news, you know. So I think that in this case in particular, we should use a lot of real-world evidence studies, but this is just because of a personal interest in this field. But anyway, this activity should be supported by governments, by health authorities, and also by manufacturers, should be conducted by the academia and by other research institutions. Guidelines and monitoring should be issued, and particularly under the supervision of ethics committees, and also contribution should are expected from investigators and also for caregivers. Then we have another challenge, which is that of adverse drug reaction spontaneous reporting, because it deserves to be implemented in this situation by health authorities, and a particular contribution should be requested by patients because they are somehow more stimulated in auto-medication in such situation, and also by poison control centers because they are at the forefront of the problem with patients, and we need to implement their contribution to adverse drug reaction spontaneous reporting. Another issue would be that of considering the effect of COVID-19 on signal detection. That should be implemented by health authorities with the contribution of the academia. So you can see that all the stakeholders are involved in countering this situation. In particular, I would like just to remark that in this situation, maybe the signal detection performance in social media would have another relevance compared to the one it has in the past. You know that this kind of research was somehow abandoned in the last years. It has a peak 5-6 years ago, that after the initial hype, scientists concluded that it was of relative importance. I think that we should try to reevaluate the signal detection in social media in this kind of situation. And finally, and likely one of the most important things is that of these communication strategies that should be implemented by health authorities. And of course, caregivers should support patients in understanding the message coming from the health authority. Unfortunately, I've seen too many caregivers that are not prepared to support such kind of information, such kind of activity toward patients, because they are the first not convinced of the particular peculiarity of the situation. And therefore, caregivers should be trainers too to support this situation. Conclusions, the pandemic has placed a strain on healthcare systems and pharmacovigilance systems too worldwide. The available systems were probably not ready to handle an emergency of such large proportion with such unpredictable characteristics. The role of pharmacovigilance in the management of such emergency is crucial, specifically the appropriate use of drugs proposed to treat the disease and the management of actual or potential consequences of inappropriate use of the same drugs. New challenges will probably arise once vaccine, for instance, will become available. We already know that the Novax have already started their battles against the use of the vaccines, and I think that it cannot be, it cannot have an explanation such a behavior from the standpoint of anyone in the world. It is important to learn from the mistakes made at this stage to stay ready to face the coming challenges. I would like to thank, this is the article in which you will find other maybe element of discussion, or element that you can use to understand even what was my thinking about this. And I would like to thank my staff for helping me in preparing this presentation in a so short time, and also in supporting me in analyzing all the literature and all the websites on the internet to realize, to produce this article. Irma Conventino, Sara Ferraro, Emiliano Cappello, Giulia Valdiserra, Daniele Focosi, and my boss, Corrado Brandizzi. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marco, for an amazing and thought-provoking talk. I'm sure this is such an important issue with the fake news all over. And we are used to fake news in politics and everything around, but when it enters our side of pharmacovigilance and safety of patients, it's really becoming an emergency. Any questions or points for Marco?
Yes, I think that we have, first of all, many people who are very enthusiastic about your presentation. Marco. So thank you so much. And I must say that I have contacted Marco only on Thursday, last Thursday, very last minute, because I was not aware of this paper, and he has agreed to do this wonderful presentation. I think that you have really spoken about something which is really a hot topic for us. And what is very striking is a conspiracy theory that are really spreading all over the world, and especially the fact that whatever we have as a result is always because the pharmaceutical industry wants to eliminate one drug which is not very very expensive toward one drug which is very expensive, and it makes me crazy about that. And I think that we have to fight this infodemic with the same arms, with Twitters, with Facebook. We have to have like a label of quality about the information that we are giving, and that I think that could be really the role of ISOP all over the world. This is about the conspiration. I think that patient education is really key for letting them know what they have to do and what they don't have to do. This is something that we are trying to do with in ISOP Israel. We have a collaboration with NIDIMED, BMedWise, a US organization focused on patient education. And I would like to finish about adverse reaction reporting. I think that we have really set up a model with this infographic, with this My E-report. And this is something that perhaps we can do all the chapters together, can try to set up this organization, this project, so that we could see very early what are the adverse reactions of such infodemic. So do we have other questions?
I think for the sake of, yes, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I think for the sake of time, the fact that we had people from 5 continents coming together to brainstorm important issues is a very good sign for us as we design the next meeting, which will be the 3rd one, which we'll plan in the next month or 2. And I want to thank, of course, first and foremost, Irene, who is not just the driving force, but also the heart of this effort, and of course our 3 amazing speakers. And I wish you all, I don't know, it's for some of you it's morning, for some of you it's becoming evening, but all the best, and we'll be all in touch. Thank you.
Gidi, I would like just to share one slide. Marco, can you go out of your share screen, please?
Yes, wait a minute. Okay.
Thank you. So I just want to share this screen, and I just want to first of all, before finishing, before starting with this slide, I just wanted to say that we will need to have the same reflection and discussion about vaccine in a few months, when we will have the same infodemic on vaccine. Now going to the next future, very next future, on 16 and 17 of September, we will have the World Patient Safety Day, and ISOP International with WHO is doing that during 2 days, 16 and 17. We are an actor of this outstanding event. Okay. And then we have a session with 4 presentation about combining tools, methods, and artificial intelligence IT to prevent medication errors. And we will present the ISOP Israel multidisciplinary strategy and our experience in Mayana Yoshua. And what we are doing is that we are collecting, we are coordinating, we are assessing all the documents who can come from the Israel country. And if you have posters, abstract, articles, infographics, video, something that you want to share with a very wide audience, it's time to do that and to send it to us before the 7th of September, please. So join us. Send all your documents, make Israel shine abroad, and thank you so much. And we will be together, I hope so, on 16, 17. Have a nice day.